When I worked for Bobby Kennedy in 1968, the senator in the presidential campaign would say in virtually every speech, politics is the noblest profession. And I remember that President Eisenhower had said something very similar to that. Today we have a guest who is a member of the United States House of Representatives from the 49th Congressional District of California. He was a very, very successful business person, but he decided he wanted to serve the public interest. That's what he's done. And we honor that today. It's a great pleasure to present to you and to ask you to join with me in welcoming, please, the Honorable Darrell, Issa.
George, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for still thinking of the body I belong to as filled with honorable men. And that is one of the challenges we face today. Elected officials, and Jim would appreciate this, at city level, at county level, at state level, and at federal level, have orchestrated a growth in government from 1945, and Reverend, you remember 1945, right?
I think I do.
Well, you know, all levels of government in 1945 only took about $1 out of every 10. Or as I like to say it, they only put 10 rocks in your knapsack, and the rest was yours to carry. Well, today, we take about 28.5% out of your pie, or put 28 pounds in your knapsack out of that 100. When we talk about competitiveness, when we talk about the way forward, what we're really talking about is, are we going to be competitive? And since Tom Garfinkel is here, you know, if we told you that in fact you simply had to have $20 million already spent before you worked on your roster, how many more of your best players would we lose? Would we win games? Particularly if New York not only gets more rocks, but spends less of them on their overhead. That's our problem here today. You know, people talk about China, and they're deeply concerned about jobs going to China. Jobs don't go to China. China competes in a global market for goods and services, and China wins. We need to ask ourselves, what is our strategy for success? Now, I've been asked to come here today, and George did, in fact, woo me and seduce me and then chain me into making sure that I promised to come. And thank you for doing it. And thank you for making sure that it was also at the Catfish Club. I'm delighted to be here today because it's only at this level of people who understand both government and the private sector that we're going to begin to find our way back. San Diego's problem of an unsustainable cost relative to services is certainly something here in San Diego we see all the time. It was the subject of the last elections. It'll be the subject of the next election. And particularly with San Diego losing money as, and Cameron, this is where we talked about this, as the state simply steals money to balance its budget. But the question is, how did the state get to this position? The state got to this position because it did not have a plan to minimize what it did to maximize the ability to innovate and invest in our businesses. That's the reason when I was in Las Vegas earlier this week, I just looked at all these buildings that were empty in Las Vegas, and I said, how are you going to fill them? He said, oh, don't worry, the next California tax increase will fill that whole 3,500. They're $2 million a piece, but people can justify that with their saving when they leave the state. And in fact, many of you know, just a few years ago, under the guise of defending and helping and protecting the mentally ill, we said we've got to have 1%. We'll only take it from people who earn over $1 million a year in this state. A group so small you probably couldn't have defined them in any large room. Stadium is filled with one table at a major game, maybe two tables at a really good game. The fact is, it's an incredibly small group. We'll take it nominal notice. What happened was, yes, we collected the billions of dollars. That's why one of the initiatives was to take the excess, far more than was needed to deal with the mentally ill, and put it back in the general fund. One of the reasons was enough of those people who earn over $1 million a year, many of whom are earning it for one and only one time in their life when they're selling their business, they left the state. They may not have left their home, they may have kept their Prop 13 protected real estate, but they moved their home domicile. We lost a huge amount of the best, the brightest, the highest income producers in other states. So many so that our revenue from that category went down even while we increased the tax 1%. The reason was simple. We're taking almost 11% out of somebody's ability to innovate and to succeed, and for that matter, simply to enjoy their own money they earn. They cross over to Incline, Nevada, or Las Vegas, goes to zero. It's an amazing situation, one in which we're telling people to go to Tennessee, to go to Las Vegas, to go to competing states. Now, I work at the national level, and I absolutely will tell you that the problems at the national level are no different than California. So instead of my talking today about China or Canada or all these other countries who compete against us and who in fact are doing well, I'm going to just make it mostly California. Because I think, in fact, if we look at California versus Tennessee, or Detroit and Michigan versus North Carolina and Georgia, what you see is a state only has to be slightly more competitive and jobs move there. A state only has to have slightly lower rates and the best and the brightest and the highest income people go there. Now, I've watched my city that I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, become, in fact, less populous than when I was born. Was part of it the fact that it wasn't very business friendly? Yes. Was part of it the weather? Probably. But when you look at the jobs that went to North and South Carolina, trust me, those are hot, humid places that are not perfect either, but they had business-friendly climates. So what is it we need to do in the future? We need to look inward. The city of San Diego needs to say, as we were increasing TOT, as we were increasing the hidden taxes, were we asking the question of, are those taxes in order to make sure that the rest of our base doesn't need to be taxed higher? Or are we going to do that, spend it, and then we're going to get a half-cent sales tax, and then we're going to get something on this and something on that? The fact is, the city was looking in terms of how much more revenue can we get for things we want to do, rather than how much less could we spend and what would be the benefit? Or even if we have this revenue, should we be spending it to induce companies to move here? Should we be using it as special incentives to create new and future high-paying jobs? It's a great question. Quite frankly, I didn't see it answered in the positive. California has managed to come up with one of the highest sales taxes in the country. Even though we're locked in by Prop 13, our actual effective revenue from property tax is in fact higher than 35 other states. Because of our high value of homes, our 1% property tax nets a tremendous amount of money, which goes to Sacramento, and as we're all finding out, is very discretionary as to whether it comes back. Certainly, we have to reform Sacramento. The best way to reform Sacramento is in fact to say to Sacramento, we can no longer tolerate your ups and downs turning into funding and defunding of counties and cities. That has to be done by the League of Cities, by the counties, and by others. And I met with Jim Madaffer here earlier because there is a need to do that. There's a need to say, we will be responsible locally, but we have to make sure that our budgets are protected. I think that's going to happen. But it still doesn't change the fact that California has some of the highest cost of public employees. It has some of the least in touch with their constituents' legislature, and it's not going to change overnight. If for a moment you can imagine, and I said this to the Reverend as we started, that California now collects as a percentage of the gross domestic product more than the federal government did, the state government, the county governments did all combined in 1945. And you ask, well, does that really matter? Well, here's the question. What essential service does California deliver to its people that it didn't deliver in 1945? Now, most of you are going, well, I have no idea what was 1945. The truth is, we had public education, we had public health, we certainly had police and fire. We, in fact, delivered all the essential services in 1945 that we deliver today. We simply delivered them for about 2% of GDP. As we're talking about healthcare in Washington, and when George invited me to do this, the healthcare debate hadn't reached the feverish pace. But I'm going to go to healthcare for a moment because I think it's the most important thing for all of us to leave today with. Healthcare consumes more of our gross domestic product, non-government and government alike, than any other single expense that we spend on. You're now dealing with a country that collects about 17% in all different ways of our gross product for healthcare. Canada, about 9%. Now, I don't want to talk about what's good in Canada or what's good here for a moment. Just ask the question. If you're an employer, an innovator, if you're in fact trying to build a business and compete globally, or at least compete here against global companies, 8% is added to your cost for our healthcare system versus Canada. How many of you in business could keep a customer if your competitor had an 8% advantage? It's one of the major factors. Now, people say, well, Canada has high other taxes. Yes, they do. They also have a strategy of their VAT or GST that when somebody exports, they give it back. They've come up with a scheme, which we are one of the few countries that doesn't have. When somebody exports, the social welfare cost in their country partially comes off in the export. Now, when I ship my products from Canada, I get back the GST from my old company. When I ship into Canada, I pay into it. It's common sense. It's a competitive question. Can the United States live forever with competitors who recognize that they will subsidize exports by removing taxes and tax imports, not tariffs, but in fact still a tax, in order to equalize and pay into the social welfare program? These are simple business strategies that we all understand, in fact, work for our competitors on a global basis. In healthcare, I'm not supporting the present health care proposal. That's no surprise. I'm a Republican. I don't think you saw any Republicans standing with President Obama saying, boy, this is perfect. But I'm not supporting it for a different reason, one that I think Republicans and Democrats alike and independents in this room are going to agree on. We spend that 17% of GDP. Canada spends 9%. The Europeans spend around 10%, depending upon the country. This proposal was going to take us to about 21% of GDP with that $1 trillion you saw being added. And by the way, that assumed certain savings that were not described but were put in as we'll find them. That assumed that, in fact, inflation wasn't going to continue to eat more away as it had. So you look and say, okay, we've got a competitive problem because our healthcare, even though it's better than Canada's, in my opinion, costs a lot more. But we're going to go from 17 to 21. Why are we going to do that? Because there's uninsured. Well, let's go through the uninsured question. Many of you were small employers. Many of you during your life have been unemployed at some time. Certainly, the self-employed person looks and says, how do I get health care? And they get these incredibly different amounts, whether they're young like Madaffer here, or they're a little more seasoned like the Reverend, they're going to get this hugely different cost. Do we need a government program to fix that? No, just the opposite. What we need is government to say we won't tolerate it. We want to have all of our people able to be part of a common pool. Now, we do this in ways, I was over at Cox Cable just before I was here, but whether you're Cox Cable or AT&T or Semper Energy delivering gas and electric, what is the one thing you know about public deliverance? Well, my phone bill is the same as your phone bill, even if the distance from the phone company is different. My cable bill is substantially the same as anybody else's, whether I live in an urban center or I live in a rural area. Government has already made the decision that public service entities have to deliver, if you will, by kind of homogenizing the cost between what my actual cost might be at a given time and somebody else's. Is this a difficult mandate? Anyone here, this young gentleman's in insurance, if the insurance companies are told, you know what, no insurance company anywhere in the nation can in fact deal with pre-existing conditions, period. They're gone, they're off the table. Portability is a right, it's off the table. Age discrimination is a right, it's off the table. What would an insurance company do? Load it into the calculation, give us a single rate, and we're done with it.
Level playing field.
Level playing field. Now, as George told you, he met me on a United Airlines flight. I'm also a private pilot, so I look at everything going on in aviation. Years ago, they didn't have that little light down the center aisle to tell you if a plane smoky and crashing to follow it to an exit row. But we've all flown on airplanes and had that briefing about, in the case of lights will guide you. Those were mandated by the federal government, and it's an interesting story to me because the airlines all wanted them. But the airlines all knew that it added weight and cost, and their aircraft were going to be out of commission for a period of time, and that was an ongoing burden. So what they basically said quietly to members of Congress was, well, you know, if you guys would mandate it so everybody had to do it, then we'd all absorb it, and it'd all be a zero sum, it'd all kind of go in the rate. And Congress did that. Or more specifically, they directed the FAA, and it ultimately became a rule. We do things for the common good all the time. I'm a libertarian Republican. I want to make as much free market as possible. But when a market is not functional for some reason and it's hurting the common good, you say, can I do something that maybe constrains certain activities, but ultimately is zero sum? It doesn't hurt anyone once you normalize the playing field. I proposed a bill just before I left Congress, and I'm selling it for real, but I'm also selling it on the principle. My bill simply says that everyone in this room can join the government plan that I enjoy. Now, if you're not a federal worker, you probably don't know that my government plan is the choice of about 200 separate plans, including Blue Cross, Kaiser, the letter carriers have their own. These are all private plans, privately administered. We simply are in the pool. And when I go to that pool, I'm not age-based. My price is not based on age. My price is not based on pre-existing condition. Why? Because in order to bid that contract, what they said was, look, we'll bid the overall pool. We'll look at it, and every time we renew, we'll give you the fees. We'll give you the fees on the actual event, and they're all large pools. Probably the smallest one is 40 or 50,000 people in it. So the good news is the federal government already has 200 options, and they're with private companies all of you are used to. You certainly would know them. Why in the world, before we redo everything, wouldn't we say, opening that up costs the federal government nothing? It allows some of you in this room that have just yourself as a sole proprietor or less than 20 or 30 employees to say, well, wait a second, let me go look at these. I can look at the prices online. Oh, this one's $5,500 and it does X. This one's $7,200 and does Y. Not only can I put it in there, but by the way, if I really want to, I can say, look, I'll pay the first $4,000 to my employees, or I pay the first $300 a month, some figure. And you pick which one you want. You've got 200 choices. Pick the one you want. Would there be an adverse selection? No. Because if everybody has that opportunity, there isn't. Now, many of you have COBRA. As employers, you have COBRA, and when people leave, the good news is they get to keep paying in. The bad news is they don't have enough money if they're laid off to do it in some cases, and you're continuing to deal with them on your whole health plan. If we opened up 200 plans to the federal government, nobody would really care about COBRA because ultimately they would pick and choose from a central pool of private plans in which they would not be discriminated against. Now, there are some things that should be done in healthcare, and I'm the first to say if we're going to drive down the costs from 17% of GDP while keeping our high-quality healthcare, but drive it down closer to our competitors, get some of those rocks out of our knapsack, there are things we must do. One of them that is very difficult for some of my colleagues, and you're going to have two of my colleagues here in a couple weeks, it's very hard for them to admit that doctors and hospitals and even the pharmaceuticals, they all practice forms of defensive medicine. They over-test, they over-proceed and prescribe because they want to be covered if they're sued. Now, I've been to Canada, I've been to most of Europe, to be honest, on your dime, I've traveled around the world even more than I did on my own dime in business. Almost every country on the face of the earth assumes that if the sovereign approves a doctor by having him join their medical association and graduate and be certified, a hospital being publicly inspected and run by people who have licenses, and pharmaceuticals, which are at least the equivalent of our FDA, they assume that, wait a second here, we bought into the safe and effectiveness. We bought into the competence. Therefore, the sovereign, if you will, the government, will limit what you can do if mistakes happen. Some countries have peer review in order to evaluate whether there should be some exception to that. But most countries protect healthcare systems from being sued for other than the actual loss. If there's actually a problem, you can get compensation in many countries, not all, but many. But you can't get this pain and suffering, these $50 million awards. You can't have a class action suit because after everyone took Vioxx or whatever, they discovered it might have hurt their heart. We don't have that. The whole world laughed at us over the breast implant thing. They're going, I don't get it. This was incredibly tested. It was regulated. It was licensed. How in the world can you be suing this company right out of existence? And of course, as we know, it turned out later science even made it a little bit more ironic. We would lower our cost by measurable amounts, 1 or 2% of GDP, just by changing that standard. And not necessarily because the procedures would be less expensive, but because doctors and hospitals would do the procedures they thought they should do and no extra. All of those things are doable at no cost. Now, there are some things that will cost. I would propose at a local level, with the federal match for federal unemployment insurance, that states begin looking and including in their unemployment insurance, collecting and preparing for, but including healthcare as a component of unemployment. Today, if I were to lose my job, no one would cry. But, or at least if some of us would. But in fact, if you lose your job today, we give you a pot of money. It is less than you were making. It's going to be for a limited period of time. And we say, oh, by the way, now instead of 10, 20, 30% of your health care costs, you have to pay 100%. What a shock to anybody, and what an inducement to take care of your family and take your chances on your health care and go naked, as they often say. That shouldn't happen. There's no question that if we were to include two components to unemployment, the unemployment in dollars and the unemployment in contribution to your health care plan, and made sure that that was at least enough to cover a catastrophic health care plan so you'd never be without basic coverage. Now, that is a solution that is not a federal solution. Certainly when the federal government is contributing to the unemployment in bad times, we would be a component to it, but it would be something that every state would come up with a scheme for and do, that every employer would recognize if they have very low unemployment, it costs them little. They have this rippling effect, it'll cost them more. But over time, what would happen is we would build a culture in which people would understand that you stay insured even between jobs. And in fact, we segregate the money, so the logical thing that usually happens when money is scarce is, I'm not sick today, I'll skip that. I don't need that. These are all things that can be done. No real cost to society, but no new bureaucracy. And that's the most important thing coming from Washington. If I give you a solution, you will pay dearly for it. Medicare costs 4% overhead to administer. Now, many of you would say that's not too bad. As a matter of fact, it's lower than the private insurers. Medicare also has a 10% verified fraud rate, about double what the rest of it is. And the fraud isn't the worst of it. It's not considered fraud if a doctor or hospital chooses to do 3 procedures instead of 2, because since we're only reimbursing about 70% of his ordinary and customary cost, the fact that he does 2 allows him to probably get the equivalent, and technically the procedure was within the bounds of consideration. But was the senior citizen given the best health care? Perhaps not. Did that senior go through an additional procedure that they shouldn't have gone through? Yes. Was it inefficient in addition to having huge fraud in Medicare and that 4%? Absolutely. So when people talk about a government solution somehow being better, let me assure you, there are some government healthcare programs that are pretty good. That is not one of them. And I'll close with this, because I have gotten very focused on healthcare, because I think part of our competitiveness is getting it right. Some of the 2 best healthcare programs you can be in. The United States military healthcare program is excellent, the active duty program. And the veterans program has been rated one of the best in the country and in the world. So you say, well, those are government programs. Yes, they are. Guess what? Those are government programs where the doctors cannot be sued by the patient, where the government absorbs that liability, where, in fact, many of the things I talked to you about earlier that I said we should implement, the government kind of implemented it for itself. And just to let you know how passionate I am that we not destroy how we take care of our men and women in uniform and how we take care of our veterans. Right now in Judiciary, one of my other committees, they are trying to pass legislation that would allow you to sue public entities. Public hospitals are presently exempt from normal litigation. They're trying to change that, they being the majority. And you say, well, why? Why is simple. There's a group that lobbies to be able to bring justice to injustice. And I appreciate bringing justice to injustice. But let's all consider, for the greater good, those injustices cause waste in the process. They cost all of us money. Wouldn't we be better off with arbitration, with oversight, with peer review, with anything that we can do to make sure there is a limited amount of mistakes and injustice, but that we protect ourselves when, in fact, as competitors, next step forward, California has to figure out how to run its budget with the same percentage of the GDP of this state as Nevada or Tennessee or the Dakotas or Alaska or any other state. Otherwise, we lose jobs to those states. And America needs to get some of its inherent costs down. And the biggest inherent cost we can get down is get healthcare right so that it starts heading down, not up, but through things that will guarantee you get the same level of care you get now, but it's simply delivered smarter. That's why healthcare reform in September will still be on my plate. It's why getting it right is worthwhile. It's why all of you have a role to play in that, in addition to saying to your city and your county and your state, we absolutely demand that you get your costs down to where we can compete against other cities, other counties, and other states, because California is too good to lose business to South Carolina, and America is too good to find itself not competitive in the rest of the world. Thank you very much.